Chapter 6 is intended to follow Chapter 5 closely, and in Chapter 5 we looked at information processing. In Chapter 6 we're going to focus specifically on the processes of learning and acquiring expertise, which obviously are directly related to informing, which is the principal theme of informing business. So we'll cover a broad range of topics in this chapter. We'll begin by looking at two elements of expertise: concept acquisition and practice. Practice being a particularly important part of expertise that's often ignored in educational systems. We'll then look at a practice-induced concept of the learning curve. We'll talk a little bit about how knowledge is structured and what type of knowledge is easy to retain and what is hard. We'll talk about retention. And finally, we'll talk about Bloom's taxonomy, which is a sort of a convenient tool for characterizing different types of cognitive tasks. We'll begin by sort of characterizing what we mean by expertise. And expertise is normally defined in terms of performance of a particular task, and expert performance is normally characterized by being smooth and involving minimal effort. So the expert seems to go through the task without having to think and without interruption. If you watch an expert pianist play, it seems as if it's totally effortless. Experts tend to be able to see the deep structure of problems. There have been a lot of studies of physics and how novices tend to be distracted by the surface elements of problems, whereas experts tend to go right to the heart of the matter. And expert performance tends to be robust. It tends to work pretty well under variations of a task within limit. Another characteristic of expertise is it takes a long time to acquire. There's been a lot of talk about a sort of 10,000 hour rule. Malcolm Gladwell talks about that in his book Outliers. But ultimately, expertise requires a lot of dedicated practice. And then expertise also has certain limitations associated with it. Performance is not always better than the novice, even when an expert perceives it to be much better. And we find a lot of business domains where that may be the case, such as making financial projections. And also we find that expertise can be quite resistant to new ideas, and sometimes experts carry with them a lot of attributes that they use in problem solving, which actually don't seem to be necessary. Sometimes they use too much information to solve a problem, more than what is really needed. But nevertheless, it's better to be an expert than a non-expert. Now, at the heart of expertise is the concept of a learning curve. And I'll display a sort of typical hypothetical learning curve here. If you take a look at the learning curve, what happens is as we repeat an activity, the time it takes to perform the activity goes down. So if you're actually reading this curve, you start out, after you've done it a certain number of times, it takes, maybe 90 seconds or whatever the unit is. Then, as the number of repetitions increases, it goes down. Now, I show this as a straight line, and it's a straight line only if you use a logarithmic scale, which is to say a scale where the values go proportional. So 10 doubled is 20, 20 doubled is 40, 40 doubled is 80, 10 doubles 10, and so forth. So that what this means is that you can frame a learning curve in terms of something like a 20% performance improvement with every doubling of the number of times performance has been made. Companies like aircraft companies use the learning curve in projecting how much they should charge for an airplane. So what happens is the earlier models of the airport, they lose a lot of money on it, but by the time they've made hundreds or thousands of that particular model, they start to make a lot of money because their costs go down with the number of units that they've created. And if you look at a lot of business strategy models, such as cost competition, being cost competitive is largely a matter of selling a lot more units, because this learning curve will help you drive down cost, increase your efficiency, as well as the obvious economies of scale. In Chapter 6, I keep emphasizing the importance of practice, because ultimately expertise tends to depend more on practice than the ability to acquire concepts quickly. And an example of the retention effect that occurs with practice is quite compelling. And this involved a study where individuals were given a simple algebra multiple choice test at different intervals after they completed schools. Now, the results were really quite compelling. Individuals who had advanced beyond calculus in their schooling essentially had perfect scores no matter how long you waited, from 5 to 55 years. On the other hand, individuals who'd taken calculus but had not advanced beyond it had scores that declined between 5 and 55 years, but they still did pretty well. They generally did about 90% on the test. Because when you do calculus, you're constantly practicing your algebra, so it helps reinforce that algebra. Now, individuals who've taken more than one algebra class started out at about 80% right after school, but then by the 55-year point, they were down to about 50%. So they really are doing a lot worse. Even though they've covered the material in more than one course, they still are doing much, much worse. Now, those folks who have only had a single algebra course, and this is exactly what was tested here, simple algebra questions from Algebra 1, not from Algebra 2. They scored 60% right after school, but by the time they'd been out for 55 years, it is as if algebra had never happened. They scored exactly the same as those folks who had never taken algebra. So what we see here is that practice has a huge impact in how long we retain information after we have learned it. In addition to the effects of practice and expertise, there is the acquisition of knowledge and information processing. And we can really think of information processing as involving 3 stages. The first of these stages is storing knowledge. And essentially, it's not just a matter of storing knowledge within our memory or on our computer. It's a matter of representing it in a form that allows it to be retrieved later on. And that takes us to the question of retrieving knowledge, because one of the major challenges that we face when we process information is actually finding stuff that we've already encountered. And if we look at the web, for example, one of the things that search engines have to do is they have to prioritize knowledge, and they have to find out which is going to be easiest and most likely to be relevant and which is not, and that's a retrieval problem. Finally, we've got the processing knowledge, and how do we manipulate knowledge to acquire new knowledge? I mean, when we learn tools like algebra and logical reasoning, what we're doing is we're basically learning tools that allow us to take one set of symbols and develop new symbols from them, or manipulate the symbols in a different way to come up with knowledge that we did not have when we started. So these are the 3 components of information processing. And this is really true in almost any informing system. A computer system has the same elements, and so does the human mind, though the way they do them is very, very different. Now, when we talk about storing knowledge and representing it, it's sort of convenient to look at it as 3 levels. Like many things in cognitive psychology, these levels are not hard and fast, but rather they're a convenient way of thinking about a problem, a conceptual scheme, as it were. So level 3 knowledge, we can call these essentially individual concepts that sort of stand alone. These concepts can be processed into relationships. It's like facts. Ideally, level 3 knowledge is generalizable. It can be applied in a lot of situations. And level 3 knowledge is particularly easy to teach through informing. It's easy to teach isolated facts. It's harder when they become related as part of a network, which takes us to level 2. And in level 2, basically we have components that are linked together in explicit ways. We can think of them as a script or a network. They're applicable to specific situations, and they can either be learned through being taught. You can get a procedure from a cookbook, or they might be learned through, say, observation, watching a cook. Now, level 3 knowledge is, level 1 knowledge is essentially what we'll call compiled knowledge. And this is how we deal with limitations of working memory. As I mentioned, working memory typically has a capacity of somewhere between 4 and 7 discrete units of information. The sort of trick for working memory is that these units of information can either be small or they can be large, tightly connected units of information, sometimes referred to as a chunk when we're talking about factual information, or an automated procedure if we're talking about sequences of events. And essentially, chunks can be as large as you want them to be. There was an interesting study in the early days of cognitive psychology where they had an individual practice for 6 months memorizing strings of zeros and ones. And I seem to recall this individual managed to get up to like over 1,000 digits could be retained after one repetition. And the way he managed to achieve this was as the numbers came in, he imagined himself in a race. He converted them into times that could be used for the individual heats. This person was a runner. And then he imagined an entire meet. And the idea is each time he moved up to a new level, he was able to manage a whole bunch more because, if the meet is your unit of information, well, the meet contains lots of individual races, but as long as you've practiced and you've managed to find ways of linking those things together, you can retain them all at once. Level 1 knowledge tends to be much more specific because it's based on practice and it is acquired with practice. So basically, these are very fundamentally different types of knowledge. And, when we look at the academic, in a certain sense, the academic is interested in these broadly generalizable concepts, things you can test with a hypothesis, whereas the expert in practice is more likely to have a lot of this knowledge. And on the next slide, we'll take a look at how you might illustrate that. So when we think about practitioners and academics, we can imagine the individual's ability to think about a number of different task cases and the specific level of knowledge where most of their knowledge comes from. So level 1, the compiled knowledge, all the way up to level 3, the kind of discrete concepts that are generally applicable. If we take a look at the expert practitioner, through practice, that individual is likely to have acquired a lot of this compiled level 1 knowledge, but it's likely to be limited to the specific set of situations that he or she has seen. On the other hand, they may be less interested in and may have less knowledge that goes broadly across the board related to tasks that they do not see. Now, we contrast this with the academic expert, and the academic expert, on the other hand, tends to have a lot of this sort of level 1 knowledge, the individual concepts, because academics are looking for generalizable and may or may not have seen a lot more different types of knowledge across many different concepts or contexts. On the other hand, because the academic does not actually practice decision making with relation to that specific task that they're studying, they have much less sort of practiced information there. Now, one of the interesting things is that this academic expert profile doesn't really look like what we described as expertise. And in a real sense, if you want to think about what academic experts are actually expert in, it is framing things as research problems or preparing things to teach, because those are the things that as academics we do over and over and over again. Whereas when we actually study a particular domain in a field like business research, we don't actually spend that much time practicing the tasks associated with doing that domain. And so what we have is two very, very distinct perspectives or representations of knowledge. And this is one of the challenges that we have when academics and practitioners try to communicate with each other, because we are in fact dealing with fundamentally different knowledge structures. So there are kind of three keys to ensuring that knowledge is stored effectively by a client. The first of these is the amount of time the specific message is kept in working memory and the degree to which there are relevant links to existing knowledge. The more links we've got, the more likely we will be able to keep it in working memory long enough for it to be stored in long-term memory. And these links can either be in long-term memory or in working memory, but that time is very important as well. Now, the next thing is the intensity of focus, and things like interest and emotion can play a major role in the effectiveness of our saving information. There are a lot of psychology studies that have shown that. And then the final one is repeated exposure. Once again, this is the practice effect, and the practice effect is very significant. Because as we saw in the case of the algebra study, the more practice you have, effectively you can make retention almost infinite with enough. I saw this particular sign in the University Mall here in Tampa, and I could not resist taking a picture of it as an illustration of the fact that what we recall is not always useful. And if we find something interesting or emotionally engaging, we're likely to recall it, even if it's not all that useful. If you can't read it, the test is simple. Name 3 supermodels and name 3 of your kids' teachers. And what it suggests is what we recall is not always necessarily what is most important. Another example that I love is the notion of frequent exposure not being enough to guarantee retention. You really need to actually pay attention, and you need to link it to other things. And what I've drawn here is intended to be a picture of your TV remote. And what I would challenge you to do is, to stop the presentation and see how well you can draw the layout of your remote without actually looking at it. And I think you will be surprised, especially given that the remote is something that you deal with many, many times a day, or at least we do in my household. When we consider information retrieval, one of the things we also need to recognize is the very heuristics that we talked about in the previous challenge can have an important impact. So think about the following statement, and this is from Kahneman and Tversky's earlier work. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, they were posed the following question. You were asked to rate the likelihood. Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. Now, when they administered this, the results of this study were that the vast majority of undergraduate students rated the second statement as more likely, as did half of the psychology graduates. Now, this defies the rule of logic because Linda is a bank teller, has to be at least as likely and almost certainly more likely than the combination of the two. But we have a heuristic known as representativeness, and representativeness causes things to pop into our head, and as we try to assess the likelihood, we're using essentially this heuristic, and this B description seems to resonate a lot more given the description of the individual. We also find that our information processing capabilities are heavily influenced by context. For example, imagine 4 cards are laid out in front of you on the table, and you are told that each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other, and what we want to do is test out the proposition that every card with a number on it has, or a vowel on one side has a number on the other. So that if we were to try to do this test, what we need to do is figure out which cards to turn over to determine whether the rule is true or false. And so you can think about this and figure out which of these 4 cards you need to turn over to satisfy the rule that if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has a number on the other side. It turns out that the majority of individuals get this wrong. This is a study by Johnson Laird. Now, we can do the same test with a slightly different view. Here we've got a series of cans of beer or Coke, and they have an age on the other side. And the test here is to figure out which cans you have to turn around to determine if a person is drinking legally, which is to say no one under 21 is drinking beer. It turns out, presented with exactly the same problem, which is a close analogy to the problem we just saw, we find out that almost everybody gets this one right. And the big difference here is the context of the problem. And it turns out that even experts are not necessarily that good at taking general rules from one problem and moving it to another. They're good at moving specific rules from one problem to another, but not these kind of general rules of logical reasoning. And once again, this can be a big challenge when we are trying to inform, because we assume, or we tend to assume, that people can generalize from one set of rules to another. To conclude the chapter, I am going to talk briefly about Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is just a classification scheme for different types of cognitive skills, and it is very commonly encountered in the field of education and, of course, the field of informing science. So if we take a look at Bloom's taxonomy, what it does is it argues that there are 6 fundamental activities that we need to perform in order to solve problems. So we've got remembering, which involves recognizing things and recalling. We have understanding. Some of the verbs they use here: interpret, exemplify, classify, summarize, infer, compare, explain. We have applying, executing, implementing. We have analyzing, differentiating, organizing, attributing. We have evaluating, checking, critiquing. And then finally we have create, which is generating, planning, producing. And the argument is that essentially nearly all cognitive tasks can be broken down into these individual type components, and the skills at the end are sometimes referred to as higher order skills, whereas things like remembering and understanding are lower order skills. And as I mentioned before, when you are informing, it is relatively easy to test whether these lower order skills are being transferred, but it's much, much harder to determine if the informing is impacting things like the ability to evaluate or create. So now for a quick wrap-up of what we have covered in Chapter 6. The first is, and most important things, that experts and novices process information differently. There are also different types of experts. Compiled knowledge is the type of knowledge that experts have, and it saves working memory, allowing us to handle larger concepts without necessarily increasing the number of concepts that we can hold at one time. Practice is what produces compiled knowledge, and therefore a tremendous amount of expertise, particularly among practicing experts, relies on compiled knowledge. That's what gives us the smoothness and the ability to process information so quickly if you're an expert. Academic experts, on the other hand, when they're dealing with their research domain, tend to rely heavily on conceptual knowledge. Now, we can be practicing experts as well with the tools we do routinely, such as preparing classes for lecture and that sort of thing. But in terms of our research, we tend to rely on expertise of a different type, expertise in sort of symbolic concepts. And that can create some real tension between practice and academics. Heuristics flavor the knowledge that we store and retrieve. That will be a subject that's emphasized in Chapter 7. And finally, cognition and problem solving depends on a lot of different skills. And it is a mistake to imagine that individuals are necessarily going to be equally good at every skill. This is one of the reasons why in the study of IQ, for example, they have started to create new flavors of IQ, because ultimately a single value does not capture the richness of human cognitive processes.